Good morning, everyone. I'm Dimitri Papadimitriou. I'm a distinguished senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. And I'm also the president emeritus of the Institute as of July 1 of this year. And I'd like to welcome you to this Google Hangout, where we're going to be discussing one of the more interesting topics that has come, if not to the center of the immigration debate, but certainly it is beginning to make some progress in terms of the kinds of conversations that take place on immigration in many parts around the world. The reason for us discussing this issue, which is how can we make the immigration system more flexible to the needs of jurisdictions below the national jurisdiction, regions, states, localities, is because immigration has a tendency to concentrate on places where other immigrants have gone, and there is a mismatch very often that goes beyond geography to actually reach into the kinds of skills that immigrants bring with them, which at times do not meet all of the needs that localities, states / provinces or regional economies need. Behind this mismatch, of course, there's also a demographic issue in many places that finds certain places becoming gradually depopulated of the kind of activism and skills and energy that is required for these sub-national jurisdictions to actually be able to do well in a highly competitive international economy. Several countries around the world have given this issue a very hard thought, and some of them have actually acted, some of those actions going back more than a decade. A particular example comes from Canada, where you have institutionalized an opportunity for provinces through something that they call the provincial nominee program to actually choose their own immigrants within the parameters, of course, that the national government places. In addition to Canada, Australia has also been testing this idea, although Australia is a relative newcomer to this issue, and it remains to be seen as to how successful the Australian experience will be. But these are not the only two places in which the conversations are taking place. Several European states have come under increasing pressure to allow regions and localities to have a say on immigration decisions, although many, if not most of these conversations are barely at an embryonic stage. In the United States, on our side of the Atlantic, there is increasing activism, not perhaps fully mainstream, but an increasing activism, and the beginning of a serious conversation about giving states and localities the opportunity to choose some of their own immigrants in order to address the simple fact that these states or parts of states or localities may need more and or a different mix of immigrants than they get. And today we have with us people who have thought hard about these issues, who are in the middle of these conversations, in many instances who have been the initiators of these conversations, and we're going to hear from them in the following order. First, we're going to hear from Steve Tabachman. He is a former senior member of the Michigan State Legislature, and in his current incarnation, I know he looks very young, but his current incarnation, he's director of Global Detroit, which is an opportunity or an effort to revitalize the economy of the region, for the Detroit area, focusing on migration and global connections. Steve will be, why don't we just hear from you, and then I will introduce the rest of the group as they speak. Steve Tabakman, you have written a paper for us. I will advertise these papers at the end of this hangout. The floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Dimitri, and thanks to the MPI to hosting this, and the Transatlantic Council on Migration for the work we did in London and this follow-up. I am a former state legislator who represented the city of Detroit. My background is really in urban economic development, community development, where for the past 20 years I've worked in Detroit neighborhoods to bring them back. Detroit is in a lot of headlines, not often in the headlines for immigration, but it's something that we're committed to doing to make sure we are in those global headlines on immigration. As you know, we, like many industrial cities in the developed world, in the West, have seen sort of a post-industrial depopulation. And we may be the poster child for that. In 50 years, from our peak population in 1950 of 1.8 million, when we were the fourth largest American city at the time, we are now probably below 700,000 people, meaning we have a city that has not changed in geographic size, but is operating with 40% of the population it once had. Although the regional, the metro population is not far off from its peak or around its peak. And maybe even has grown a little bit. That depopulation has only continued in the last 10 years, where we went from 1 million people in the 2000 census to 713,000 in the 2010 census, with a quarter of our population loss just in those 10 years. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati that are far below the national average in terms of the percent foreign-born are continuing to see declines, while many U.S. cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia that have robust immigration have turned the corner and have seen recent growth. Detroit experienced the largest municipal bankruptcy this past year, and we are still in the bankruptcy process. The residents that we do have are often very poor, and while regionally this region suffered a lot because of the auto industry and the global collapse, its recovery is on track. The city is still struggling somewhat. Interestingly enough, this region is close to the national average in terms of foreign-born, slightly below the 13.5 or 13%. It, like most Midwestern and Rust Belt and industrial metros, tends to attract a very highly educated immigrant population. Here in Michigan, about close to 40% of the foreign-born have a 4-year college degree, which is significantly higher than about 23% of the domestic population. It's a highly entrepreneurial population. According to the U.S. Small Business Administration, immigrants have been starting businesses at 3 times the rate of non-immigrants or native-born Michiganders. And according to research by UC Berkeley and Duke, a full third of our high-tech firms between 1995 and 2005 had an immigrant founder or co-founder. The challenges are compounded on the city basis, where more than 90% of Metro Detroit's immigrants live in the suburbs, and where Detroit, with its population in 2010, was the 18th largest city in the country as a city. It was the 135th largest foreign-born population. It's the only top 25 city to be outside of the top 100. In fact, if the city had the 18th largest foreign-born population, it would have 108,000 more residents, close to half the folks that we lost between 2000 and 2010. So our response began in 2009, 2010 with a private nonprofit sector response that included the Chamber of Commerce, the foundations, and a number of advocates. It's known as Global Detroit. We looked at the issue. We identified opportunities for action. We have now launched 5 full programs with a number of other programs on the way. Those programs have raised a total of $7 million in philanthropic and governmental and corporate support. They include an ambitious micro-enterprise program in the city for African Americans and immigrant entrepreneurs. We've just graduated our 200th graduate through that program. We work with Welcoming America and have a Welcoming Michigan campaign that includes a welcoming committee in a neighborhood in the city of Detroit to integrate non-immigrants and immigrants when they live in the same neighborhood. It includes a network of traditional integration services known as Welcome at Detroit, and you can now search through ESL classes, citizenship classes, legal services, etc. They include what we think is the first fully staffed international student retention program in the country. So Michigan colleges and universities have 28,000 international students studying in them. These students are 3 times as likely, 60% of them are in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics STEM fields. Most of them are in graduate degree programs. These are the most talented new economy workers in the globe. And in fact, if you look at the high-tech statistics that Duke and Berkeley put out, the average high-tech immigrant entrepreneur starts their business 13 years after they enter the U.S., and the #1 reason they come to the U.S. is to get an education. So we see our International Student Retention Program, known as the Global Talent Retention Initiative, as the pathway to being the Silicon Valley of the Midwest. Last month, or 2 months ago, we were pleased to open the 4th office of Upwardly Global, a national nonprofit working in San Francisco, New York, and Chicago to help skilled immigrants and refugees connect with employment opportunities. Those are the 5 launched initiatives. We are working on a connector program for young professionals to develop mentors. We're about to launch a mayor's office at Immigrant Affairs. There's the first ever Detroit City Council Immigration Task Force. And Governor Snyder, this past year, a Republican governor, announced the Michigan Office for New Americans. So we have a statewide office. Global Detroit, I'm about to conclude, but Global Detroit also has spearheaded a Global Great Lakes Network, which includes a 10-state region and at least 13 programs like ours from Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Columbus, Cleveland, Dayton, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and other areas. But the last thing I want to comment is federal government policy. And this January, Mayor Mike Duggan, our new mayor, and Governor Snyder wrote a letter to the federal government requesting that a variety of visa categories be used to bring 50,000 targeted visas to the city of Detroit. Ideally, those would be skilled visa holders, and this could be done via regulatory powers. It would probably be quite a shift here in this country. It would be similar, I think, in scale in terms of the history to something as profound as maybe the DACA program, the Deferred Action Program. But we do think it is something that the government could do. There, to date, has not been a response by the federal government, but I think maybe as the neighbor of Windsor, Canada, and Ontario, Canada, we see that across the Midwest, what I described happening in Detroit is a number of local run initiatives from mayors, chambers of commerce, foundations, and nonprofits that have a very different take on the federal topic of immigration and are seeing immigration and immigrants as an economic opportunity to help cities that have been deindustrialized, that are transitioning into an information age economy, that want highly talented, highly educated global workers, and frankly that have rapidly aging workforces and need low-skilled workers as well, and that are depopulating. We see immigration as a real positive on all levels here, and we would like, one of our barriers is not only to overcome the last 75 years it's been, at least since we've been a hub for immigrants, and overcome that last almost century of history, but we need the flexibility under the federal law to get those immigrants here. And we'd like to, if we don't get federal immigration reform comprehensively to allow more immigrants, we'd at least like to have the flexibility to go after those that we need. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to Dimitri.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think you're a perfect example of what a combination of commitment, imagination, hard work, and the ability to persuade others can what a difference it can make in a relatively short period of time. Congratulations. Before we move to our next speaker, I would like to invite our viewers to email questions to communications@migrationpolicy.org or to tweet to #MPI cities. And now that I've done these administrative things and I will not get killed by my colleagues, let's turn now to our second speaker, Rudy Shafee. Rudy, it's a pleasure to see you again. We had the pleasure of holding our Transatlantic Council on Migration meetings last November in London, in your beautiful offices. And for those of you who are not aware of it, the Transatlantic Council on Migration is one of the signature international initiatives of the Migration Policy Institute. The topic of that particular meeting was pretty much the kinds of issues that we're discussing today. And I would like to invite Rudy, who has worked at the Greater London Authority as the Principal Policy Officer for Immigration in the Office of the Mayor. And she works with the Mayor, his deputies, and senior staff to maintain and increase London's competitive edge as a global city for business, arts, culture, and education. And I would like to ask Rudy to discuss London's human capital needs and whether they're being met by UK immigration policy. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Dimitri. Yes, it was our pleasure to host the discussions that took place last year because there are issues that we have been thinking about here at City Hall. The Mayor announced last year that he wanted us to think about a London visa and what that might look like. And I just want to outline a little bit why that thinking came about. And it's absolutely right, Dimitri, that it's fundamentally based on our human capital needs. So let me just paint a picture for you. London is not just within the UK context, London is not just a city, but it's really a region given its size and its demography. So in terms of migration trends to the UK as a whole, they continue to be what is classified as high, so about 200,000 annual net migration. There has been recently a shift towards higher levels of migration from the southern EU countries due to their economic situation. And at the same time, we've seen a drop in non-EU migrants, high-skilled migrants coming from outside the EU to work here or to study here. And that drop has been driven not by international migration trends, but by changes to the UK migration policy. Now, this has a significant impact on London because London is home to nearly half of all of the UK's migrants. A third of Londoners were born abroad, and we fundamentally believe that this is part of London's success story, that over the years and decades and even centuries, as the Mayor would say, global talent has pooled within London and helped grow and boost the economy. Most recently, the Open Monitor has designated London as its first city within its city ranking. So London's openness, its diversity, it's part of what makes it globally a success. Now, with regards to our labour market needs, I'm going to start with a little bit of the sort of macro level picture in terms of our skills analysis. The GLA, the Greater London Authority Economics team, has recently published a labour market projection for London's needs. So currently, we estimate that about 60% of jobs in London are actually professional, managerial, technical jobs. So these are jobs that have within them a higher than average percentage of employees that hold a degree or even increasingly a higher degree. So London's labour market is increasing, labour market needs are increasingly shifting towards high skills. Within that context, we have seen quite significant employment resilience during the recession, something that hadn't been noticed in previous recessions. And actually, we are now forecasting a growth of about 30,000 new jobs per year for the next 30 years. So that's about 850,000 jobs in the next 30 years being created within London. And those will be mainly professional, scientific and technical jobs. So there is an increased demand for high skills. Now, our current trend projections suggest that this can be met with current supplies, including domestic replenishment, which of course is an important driver, social and policy driver for us. But none of this accounts for significant migration shifts. So radical changes in immigration policy, whether that's in the context of EU migration or non-EU migration, could have a significant impact on this. Other recent surveys have also shown, for instance, the Hayes Recruitment Global Skills Index have shown that there is a high level of talent mismatch within London. So while there may be a certain pool of skills, they don't necessarily meet the skills we need. And this has been backed by many business surveys from the Chamber of Commerce and the Federation of Small Businesses. Now, if I can just give two examples of where we take this big macro picture that is saying that if current trends continue, we can meet it. Actually, at a sectoral level, we've seen some very significant challenges. Now, we discussed Max Nathan's fantastic paper on London's tech city needs at the last conference. And that has been highlighted throughout our conversation and dealings with the tech industry, that skill shortages within that sector, which is a fantastically growing and flourishing sector within the London economy, skill shortages are actually pushing wages up quite dramatically. So what's happening is if wages continue to be unsustainable for small businesses to meet them, then the sector will have to cool down its growth, which is extremely worrying for us. So it's not just about getting the skills and talent mismatch corrected, but it's also making sure whether supply and demand brings pressures on wages to continue to foster an innovative environment. Another sector which is extremely significant to the London economy is the creative and culture sector. London is now leading globally in this field, from both the culture, the creative, but also where the creative meets the tech sector. So gaming and CGI are very, very significant growth sectors in London. And the London Culture Strategy Group, which is a formal strategy group set up by the mayor and chaired by the deputy mayor, recently commissioned a study looking at the relationship between the current visa system and the culture and creatives. And this brings me on to why we actually decided that we needed to really look at new models of visas and possibly city visas. Because what the study found was that the issue wasn't so much about net numbers, but it was more about the way a 21st century creative cultural industry functions doesn't meet the way the current national government migration system has been set up necessarily. So, for instance, London has, the UK has two fantastic and globally leading visa routes, one for entrepreneurs, so if you want to come and set up a business, and another one for investors. Those are not significant for the creative industry, where as an entrepreneur, the way you run a business is much more reliant on yourself and your own talent rather than creating and manufacturing a process and hiring more people. So some of those conversations are being had. Some of those challenges are what we would call more operational. But it still brings a fundamental question to, if we look at where our economy is going, the sectors that are growing, the modes of employment within them, what is the kind of immigration system we need to meet that? Now, London's economic model is a globally competitive one. So when we are competing for talent, we are not competing with the rest of the UK. And this is where the regional visa becomes more significant. We are competing with New York, Silicon Valley, Berlin for the tech sector, for instance. We are competing with Boston, Basel for the life sciences piece. So we are really fishing in a small but very, very significant pool of brightest talent. And this is what brings me to what we dubbed the London visa. So what we wanted from the London visa was actually a quota of quite a small number of 1,000 within a pool of 1,000 visas. We wanted for specific high growth sectors, namely tech, fashion, and design. So this visa route already exists within the science sector, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So we wanted within those sectors to have almost a sort of supply-led visa route where individuals, the brightest and the best talent within those industries, could self-sponsor and just come to the UK, and we could actually go out there and sort of fish and advertise and market to those people to bring them to London. Now, the significance of that and the driver for the mayor wasn't so much this sort of technical niche that I have explained that we work on, but it was really important in terms of messaging. So some of the more recent changes that had happened at the national level around migration. So for instance, in the UK, we had a very generous opportunity to work after studies if you had a study visa from outside the EU. That was shut down, and that had a very negative ripple effect and sort of sent a message overseas that London was closed for business. Compounded by that, there was a series of issues around visitor and tourism visas that were becoming extremely complex. So this message that was happening last year was what drove the mayor to say that we need to send a message to say that London is open for business, but also we need to be positioning ourselves in certain areas. We cannot build a border around the M25. So a regional visa would be somewhat arbitrary, symbolic. So the focus was mainly on what is it we want to say about London, a centre for tech, a centre for creative industries, and now we're promoting London as a centre for life sciences. We have a new program called MedCity, and we will be looking carefully about how this life science offer to the global talent pool fits within our London visa asks. Finally, I just want to say something about the policy challenges we face here in London and in the UK with regards to a regional visa. So I've talked about how we're a small country, we're not necessarily very regionalized in terms of how we're governed. So really, if someone gets a visa to come to London or in every other part of the UK, they will be able to travel freely within it. So we have to think carefully about what those drivers are. But fundamentally, there is currently a mismatch between the national policy, which is to drive down numbers, and really what as London we see a need to really focus on the quality. So we don't necessarily want less migrant if there are masters international students in STEM subjects. We don't necessarily want less migrants if they are coming here, if they are the sort of leading fashion designers of the future from outside the European Union. But we're stuck with two slightly difficult political scenarios. One of the biggest challenges we have is, I'm sure you've heard internationally that on the 18th of September, Scotland will be holding a referendum on independence. So of course, as we advocate for a London visa, we are very much sort of, the little voice as Scotland and other parts of the UK, are much stronger about how they want to run migration policies within their countries, their nations. So that's been one of our challenges. And the other challenge is, of course, that London is a political, the Mayor of London is a political institution, and the Mayor has his own position and his own point of view, and he would like to see a city where our relationship with our Commonwealth partners is just as strong as our relationship with our European partners. So he wants, as well as the brightest sort of French tech talent or Spanish creative sector, he wants that to be open much more widely to our Commonwealth partners, particularly within sort of countries like New Zealand. We've seen quite a significant drop in highly skilled migrants since the closure of some of our immigration routes. And I think that's an important place to put our city migration needs within that context, that we have our own political drivers and agenda.
Thank you very much, Rudy, and this was a fascinating explanation of what it is that you're trying to do. I thank you very much for building the case for the interconnectedness among the different kinds of sectors and activities, and how important hubs and clusters are to making progress economically, socially, culturally, and how all of these things tie together. Perhaps this is a wonderful example of the kind of innovation, the kind of experimentation that we all need to come to terms with if we are going to have immigration systems that are going to be even more responsive to the needs and aspirations of our own people, not just those of would-be immigrants. And now we're going to turn to my colleague, Madeline Sumption, from the Migration Policy Institute. Madeline directs all the research for the international programs of the Institute, and she has written a rather compelling paper that actually looks at the existing cases where sub-national jurisdictions have an opportunity to choose their own immigrants. And only to be fair to you, Madeline, because if I am not fair with you, you're going to probably exact some sort of a price. I will give you no more than 10 minutes because that's how long your other colleagues took in discussing their work. The floor is yours, Madeline.
Great. Well, thank you, Dimitri, and thanks also to Steve and Rudy for joining us for this conversation. I think London and Detroit provide particularly good examples of how different the needs of cities can be and the extent to which those needs can really differ enormously from the average at the national level, which of course is where immigration policy is usually made. So what I thought I'd do is spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the questions that raises for immigration policy at the national level and how those policies can reflect some of the local variation and the local economic circumstances and needs that we see. And I'm going to look particularly at this common question that's come up a number of times in the United States and also in several other countries about whether cities and regions should be able to select their own immigrants and how that would happen in practice. Now, as Dimitri mentioned, the most important evidence on this is from two countries that have experimented quite significantly with devolving responsibility for immigration policy to regional authorities, and that's Australia and Canada. In both countries, the national government allows regional governments to nominate prospective immigrants for immigration based on criteria that those regions select themselves. There are also some national level requirements which are pretty significant in Australia, somewhat less significant in Canada. And once people qualify through those routes, they may be required to stay in the particular region that sponsored them for a certain amount of time before they gain an unconditional permanent resident status. So how these policies work in practice is that there are two main situations in which regional visas are particularly attractive. The first is for people who, for some reason, are not eligible for visas at the national level, either because they have lower skill levels or because they don't have a job offer, for example. And the second is for people who are, in principle, eligible at the national level, but who face a national system that is extremely inefficient and that is not going to deliver them a visa within any reasonable time frame. Now, in theory, if you have an efficient employer-sponsored immigration system, then there's a good argument that subnational immigration shouldn't be needed at all, because local employers select their people based on the circumstances that they face in their particular area, and so national visas which are sponsored by employers already to some extent are reflecting local demand, at least better than a lot of other metrics that are available to policymakers. One problem with this is that in some countries the national system has really failed to meet that demand. This was actually a major factor behind the popularity of Canada's provincial nominee program, where there was a huge backlog in applications, and it took many years in some cases to process people for immigration. And of course, in the United States, the dysfunctions with both the temporary and the permanent immigration system have also motivated some discussion of creating a separate system of subnational visas. Now, of course, if that is the reason for wanting a subnational system, one can argue that fixing the national system would make more sense than patching it up at the local level. That would be a second best solution, although possibly one that may be politically more feasible. The other reason, and I think one that's probably slightly more compelling, is that subnational visas can be used for people who don't qualify for national level immigration. Now, in practice, what this has meant is that in Australia and Canada, at least, the visas have generally been used for low and middle skilled people who don't meet the skills thresholds at the national level. If you have both subnational and national systems, then the highest skilled people will be eligible for the national system. And in general, not always, but in general, they would usually prefer to go through that national system because it gives them more options and doesn't tie them to a particular place. I should mention at this point that the system that Rudy was talking about that was proposed for London is slightly different in that we are talking about very high skilled people, but for them the issue is that they wouldn't necessarily have to have a job offer. So it's a slightly different type of policy, and we can discuss that in a little bit more detail in the Q&A perhaps. But I think for the most part, and certainly how these policies have been used in Canada and Australia, one limitation of the policies is that they can't necessarily be used to attract the very best and the brightest. However, if you accept that limitation, there are some potential benefits of making those types of decisions at the subnational level. Mainly the fact that not all localities welcome additional low and middle skilled immigration. Not all of them necessarily have enough jobs to offer those people. And so making these decisions at the subnational rather than the national level could allow different areas to make different decisions about their capacity to admit and to integrate those people. So I will finish with just a couple of the policy issues that I think really need to be addressed if subnational visas are going to work. The first of those is retention, which is whether immigrants stay in the areas that nominate them. In principle, it's possible to tie immigrants through the terms and conditions of their visa to a particular place by saying that they can't renew the visa if they don't demonstrate that they have stayed there. But after a certain amount of time, and in Canada and Australia that's generally been quite short, up to about 2 years, they would receive the right to live in any area of the country. And if they leave at that point, then it rather undermines the purpose of the subnational visa system. So it really matters the extent to which areas are able to retain their people. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of publicly available evidence on this from Australia. For Canada, there is some quite good evidence, which, based on a evaluation that Citizenship and Immigration Canada conducted a few years ago, that looked at people who'd arrived through provincial nominee programs between 2000 and 2008. And they found that a majority of those people, around about 70%, were still living in the province that nominated them, but that there was huge variation between the provinces. So some did extremely well at keeping their people, and a handful of provinces did spectacularly badly. The second issue that needs to be addressed is integration. Now, in general, this wouldn't be the case for the London visa proposed, but in general, subnational visa programs have been used to encourage immigrants to go to less traditional destinations where they wouldn't necessarily be attracted to otherwise. And one of the possible risks of this is that some destinations aren't popular for a reason, which is that there are relatively few jobs available for them there. That's not universally the case in low immigration places, but it often is the case. And if that is the situation that immigrants enter into, it may be harder to integrate them once they arrive, especially if we're talking about admitting people with slightly lower skill levels, as has been the case in the Australian and particularly in the Canadian case. So I think those are both issues that it's important that areas considering designing these policies should be aware of, and it's also important that if they're going to accept these immigrants, that they should also be committed to supporting their integration once they arrive. With that, I will turn it back to you, Dimitri.
Thank you very much, Madeline. And before I say a few things and then open it to a conversation, perhaps among our speakers, if you have questions, please email them to communications@migrationpolicy.org or tweet to #MPI-cities. So I think that these have been extraordinarily useful and smart interventions, conversations. But I'd like to address the two cautionary remarks that Madeline has put on the table that are really, in a sense, part and parcel of a single overarching question, which will determine, I think, over time, whether these efforts are successful or not. So success, however we wish to define it, the neutral way of defining success is demonstrating the ability to retain immigrants at the place where they initially go to through these new programs, beyond their initial probationary period, because that's really what we're talking about, whether they're 2 or 3 years. It doesn't really matter that much, although I suspect 3 years probably give both the receiving community and the immigrants themselves an opportunity to sort of test, how well they get along together. And clearly that puts a pressure on the receiving community, perhaps more than immigrants themselves, to be able to demonstrate to the newcomers that they're welcome, that they become integrated, that they can raise their families, that they can do well economically. And as a result, there will be no reason for them to try to move elsewhere once the initial period expires. As Madeline said, there is a difference between the idea that Rudy has put on the table and the idea that Steve has put on the table. And Rudy, you probably know this, so I apologize in advance. The United States has had in the books since 1990, in fact, a self-immigration visa. It's at the highest end, but it allows artists and business entrepreneurs, etc., but who have demonstrated excellence and success in their prior careers to self-immigrate to the United States. We don't do that easily in the United States. We have a complex system that tries to constrain, much independent initiative when it comes to immigration. So perhaps if I can go to you, Steve, first, and I think your answer has already been implied in some of the things that you said, but could you talk to us a bit of how do you expect to create the conditions, whether it's Welcome in America or others, that will help people succeed and stay? Because as all of us discussed in London last November, some of the conditions that have led to the relative depopulation of Detroit over the past 2 years, the past 10 years, whatever it is, are also the conditions that need to be addressed in order for people to succeed and stay in Detroit. Safe cities, policing function, education systems that work, etc., etc. So if you don't mind saying a few more words about these things.
Sure. Well, those integration systems for us are our recruitment systems. So we came to the conclusion that it was unlikely that Detroit or the nonprofit sector would be able to travel abroad and recruit people and get them here the way London has described. I mean, we're not London, and we're also talking about what we hope is much bigger than just 1,000 visas over the coming years. And so we feel that retention is the strategy towards recruitment, and that integration is the fundamental cornerstone of retention. And we want to do a better job than we have done historically in this country over the last 100 years, and particularly in a Rust Belt city that has been losing population that we have done in the last 25 years. And so it is a broad retention strategy. It, as I've always said, it looks at both high-skilled and low-skilled workers and their needs are very different. There are social needs, there are government service needs, and then there are neighbor-to-neighbor relation needs that Welcoming America has really excelled at, and that happens on the local level. So we pursue all of those things, and we did a lot of listening, a lot of outreach in creating our strategy with business leaders, with ethnic community leaders, and asking very broad, qualitative questions about what brought your community to the region, what would keep you here, how would you expand. And we even despite Detroit's woes, we see lots of secondary migrations here. The Bangladeshi community coming here from New York and Queens for the value proposition in Hamtramck, which is an inner-ring suburb in parts of Detroit, to buy homes. The last thing I'll say, which is just became evident in the comments that were being made, is that economic development policy, when you start talking about these sectors, really happens on the metro level. And so having a federal immigration system that can accommodate that is really smart and really important. We have, despite our economic woes in Southeast Michigan and Detroit, we literally have thousands and tens of thousands of jobs in high-skilled sectors that go unfilled every month. We're one of the fastest growing IT sectors in the country regionally. We have huge electrical engineering, automotive design job needs, and huge, like everywhere, healthcare needs that are growing rapidly. And this is a region that wants to tackle that and use that as a system of growth, and we are blocked by federal immigration law to do that. So having a regional system makes a lot of sense, but as you said, success will really require integration and retention, and you can focus on those things today. You don't need to wait for federal reforms to be successful in that game.
Very well done, Steve. Thank you very much. Now, we're going to take some questions from our listeners, our viewers. One of them, I think, is addressed to you, Madeline. You mentioned that some provinces in Canada have done particularly well, and some of them not particularly well, or perhaps very poorly. Could you give us a couple of examples and perhaps say a couple of things about the reasons for the success in one part and the failure on the other part?
Yeah, so I mentioned that on average, among immigrants who came under the provincial nominee program between 2000 and 2008, around 70% were still living in the region that nominated them in 2008. The highest retention rates, much higher than that, the vast majority, over 90%, for example, had stayed in British Columbia and Alberta, which were the most popular regions. Now, interestingly, they were also the regions with the greatest numbers of jobs and tend to be the regions that received more of the people who were leaving other provinces. They tended to go to British Columbia and Alberta, as well as, of course, Ontario. And then some of the already less popular destinations, like Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island, only retained a minority of their immigrants, so about a quarter and a third, respectively, during that period. So I think in terms of some of the factors, I think the availability of jobs was important. We also see that provinces that required people to have a job offer or work experience before they got the visa were more likely to have high retention rates. And the evaluation also found that people with better language skills were more likely to stay in place.
Yes, thank you very much. And I recall from my conversations and lectures in the maritime provinces, Newfoundland and places like that the local government has been particularly imaginative in terms of having a system of what in the United States we might call it land grants for people with agricultural interests from Europe and elsewhere to come and stay. Those people tend, of course, to stay, but the economy and the climate always plays a big role in this. We have another question that I think it's a particularly interesting question. I don't think, Rudy, I'm not trying to exclude you, but I don't think, although this may actually be a question for you too. The questioner says, what kind of opposition has been seen in reaction to the Canadian or Australian systems? What groups or sectors have been most opposed? What arguments have been offered? We know that the migration climate in Europe, in the UK, is not a particularly a positive one. So have you caught any flack, particular flack that is directed at you and the mayor's office?
The migration debate in the UK is actually quite complex. So when we look at transatlantic and British sort of social attitude surveys, it is right that overall there is quite a high level of negative feelings towards migration. There is a strong desire to see a reduction in migration. But when you dig deep and you ask people, well, what kind of migrants are we talking about, there is generally a lot of support to increase certainly high-skilled migration, and the kind of migrants we were trying to catch, if we were able to sort of get as far as saying that story, the response was quite positive. I think the biggest flack we got, Dimitri, and that won't surprise anyone, is that it didn't go far enough. and of course it couldn't within the context we were operating in. But the challenge is so vast for many of our commercial partners and our private sector partners that sort of they wish they had seen more. And I think this is quite relevant to Madeleine's challenge around regional retention and the regional limitations that you raise. In a way, they're not a direction of travel that we would want to impose for really two reasons within the UK context. One is that within the kind of sectors we're talking about, it's not really relevant to their economic model. So you could tie someone to London via their employer, but that employer could just as easily rent a sort of small office, headquarter it here, and really their staff are operating on a kind of some sort of basis across the country, and more likely globally, as we see increasingly. So almost the sort of the sectors and the industry and the modern ways of working we're talking about here, a physical regional retention, would be very limiting. And of course we have the practical issues that we don't have a border around the M25, and more importantly we don't have borders across much of Europe. So the regional retention is actually contrary to the direction of travel within the EU itself with the blue card. So there is an increasing school of thought that actually free movement of people within Europe should include free movement of migrants, or certainly high-skilled migrants, and particularly in graduate talent within Europe. So I think it's slightly more nuanced here, the debate, and how we would be able to implement it.
Very smart answer. Thank you very much. It puts the onus, in a sense, on a city or a region, to make itself welcoming enough. This way, people will choose it. People who have opportunities to go anywhere else within the EU 28. To choose London over, let's say, Paris or another place. And there's a question that's directed to Steve, and this is a very targeted small answer question. Hint, Steve. Has the state government and Governor Snyder offered any resources toward integration services? Has he made any commitments? Does he understand the connection between, immigration and the kinds of integration planning that would be required?
The short answer is yes. It's been small, and it's been in the high-skilled context. So there has been some state support for the International Student Retention Program. That is an NGO, a nonprofit-run initiative. 2 years of funding for that, and then there's been some funding to open up the Upwardly Global Office for skilled immigrants and refugees to connect with job services. And then, of course, the office was literally launched this year, so other initiatives haven't been announced, but those have been the integration supports that he's provided to date.
Thank you very much. A question to all of you. And that will be the last question that I will ask, and then I'll give you an opportunity to stay to have a few closing remarks. How are you working with the corporate sector? I mean, they're vital in all this. Steve, you already explained that they're a big part of it. In London, of course, you work extremely closely with your corporate sector. In Canada, just as Madeleine said, and in Australia, the employers are front and center in the system and all that. How committed is your corporate sector to the success of such a program, where such a program were to be initiated? Perhaps Rudy?
Yes. So we have formal engagement mechanisms with the corporate sector, funded either through national programs like the London Enterprise Panel, or through just mayoral initiatives. We have all sorts of business engagement programs. So we engage with them formally, but really they drive the intelligence behind it. We didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's have a London visa. We thought, actually, what we are hearing are the challenges that they face we were unable to unblock them at a national level. So it was more of a kind of, okay, well, if we can't unblock it for the whole country, what is it we can say at a city level, or where can we try and find routes in within the city level? And actually, since the mayor made his announcement and we started going down the route of a London visa, other parts of the UK that in fact are trying to develop their own type of cluster economies have also sort of touched base with us and contacted us about that. So we do engage formally, we engage through intelligence, but also it's not. There are operational issues within the UK immigration system as well. So whereas some routes may be available, then they're just not necessarily working in practice for certain groups. And one of the ways we've engaged with business is we've acted as a kind of sort of a counselor or a matchmaker between the immigration operational, the visa operational people, and certain sectors within London, so small businesses, the tech sector, and we're going to start with the creative sector this year to help them perhaps better navigate the system where the routes are available.
Thank you. And Steve, you mentioned that you have collected or you have commitments for $7 million. Have the business community, including the large employers in the area, have they been a big part of that? Could you give us an idea?
No, it's been mostly the foundations. Snyder has put more in than the corporations. We're talking of that $7 million, maybe $100,000 of it is corporate funding. I would say that we have support from chambers and advocacy organizations, but the reality is most local businesses just want problems solved immediately. And so even as we bring new integration tools to the market, like the International Student Retention Program, breaking through the old ways of doing business is difficult. And so we get great support from their leadership, from their organizations and institutions, but when it comes to actually changing the way they do business to fit a more global model, that is a little bit of a struggle.
So there is a need for a conversation, an ongoing conversation between you and Rudy, and exchange ideas of how to get those folks who ought to be engaged in a real way, engaged in a real way. The last question, it's a good comment, so I feel compelled to actually take it. And the question is it fair to say that cities, regions, states, countries, etc., that fail to encourage immigrant attraction and retention will be left behind in the race, in quotes, to build their economies? And I think that we all understand around this table that indeed there is a hands-down economic case for immigration, particularly targeted, even more particularly high-skilled immigration or entrepreneurship and immigration. And I think that by this time, it is important that we all realize that. We also know that there's a reaction to immigration. It typically is not the kind of reaction, the reaction that your kinds of issues bring, but nonetheless, we all have to be very careful with this issue because it gets toxic very easily, particularly if we make any mistakes on the way there. I would like to give you an opportunity to make any closing remarks, and we'll start with Madeline, then we'll go to Rudy, and then we'll have you, Steve, at the last word.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think I'll use this opportunity then to answer the previous question, which was about the reaction of the private sector. I think that there is an interesting dynamic of these programs that wasn't really discussed, which is that they do introduce more complexity into the immigration system. And so I would echo what Rudy and Steve both said, which is that fixing the system at a national level is often a priority for the private sector, and it has some advantages. There is an advantage for private sector actors, especially larger employers who employ people in multiple different places. They generally want to be able to offer all of their staff the same kind of package, and they may want to be able to move them around between places. And so having a subnational visa system could be a drawback from that perspective, and I think is something to weigh against the potential advantages that we've been discussing.
Rudy, final thought, 30 seconds.
Well, I just want to thank you and MPI really for bringing these sort of issues and debates on visas and skills really to this audience. It's interesting to share how we're differently approaching it, but some of the challenges are very similar. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure seeing you again. And Steve?
I'll just echo those remarks. I think there is, as you said, an emerging awareness and proactive field of economic development around immigration from the local level. And we do know that immigrants can power economic growth. What we're really unclear about is whether efforts like Global Detroit, the other partners in the Global Great Lakes Network, whether or not we can cause that immigration. So can we create better integration services? Probably. Will that lead to retention? A little less probably, but probably. Will that actually create economic growth? I mean, we want to be Toronto and Vancouver in 50 years, and it's just not clear whether $7 million in an array of initiatives will put us on that path.
Well, let's make it 20 years. 50 years is too long for me. I'd like to thank you very, very much for an excellent and exciting 1 hour. And I'd like to advertise some of your papers. So if you will allow me, I will read them. And you can find all of them at www.migrationpolicy.org/transatlantic. Steve's paper is Revitalizing Detroit. Is there a role for immigration? ? Max Nathan and Rudy made a reference to it in her initial remarks. Wrote The Human Capital Needs of Tech City, London. Madeline Sumption wrote Giving Cities and Regions a Voice in Immigration Policy. Can national policies meet local demand? And, you know, my council statement that was the result of our conversations in London in November, Migration's Local Dividends, How Cities and Regions Can Make the Most of Immigration. I thank you very much, and I thank all of our viewers and listeners for joining us. Have a good afternoon.